I'm Scott Kelly from the Division of Mission and Ministry, and it's a great privilege to work on projects like this. So thank you to Wendy Roder-Weiss and the staff of the Visiting Artist Series and Associate Dean Joanne Zielinski. So we've met Susanne. Thank you very much for the excellent film. We have a lot to talk about tonight. I'd like to introduce Chuck Levesque, who is President and Executive Director of Depaul USA. Chuck is responsible for setting the strategic direction of Depaul USA and deploying the organization's resources to realize strategic goals. So he works every day on a number of the programs that, we got a sense of that from the film. Kat Johnson is director of the Institute for Global Homelessness. She has worked on issues related to housing and homelessness for 10 years in communities around the globe. Prior to joining IGH, Kat was project manager for Community Solutions' 100,000 Homes campaign that you saw in the film. So our panelists have a lot of experience working with this issue, so we'll have a really good conversation digging a little bit deeper into some of these issues. Our discussion this evening is going to have three parts. The first one is thinking about making the invisible visible, so that's going to be a theme in the first segment. The second one is ending homelessness from a program perspective. What does it look like? What do successful programs look like, or how do you think about, sort of long-term solutions to this? And then the third segment is really focusing on ending homelessness from a policy perspective. So when we think of this at a, maybe a national or international level, where do we see kind of, what does the data tell us about effective solutions? So Susanne, I'd like to start with you asking a question. I was really struck by Mark Horvath's story and the work to create InvisiblePeople.tv, how important that was. For me, I see homelessness almost on a daily basis, walking from Union Station to where I work at Jackson and Wabash. So what appears to be very visible is not really totally visible. So I'm wondering what are some of the invisible elements that you think should be made more visible?
I really appreciate you asking that question because I, like you, before I started working on this film, did exactly the same thing. That I would walk by people on the street, maybe have a slight awareness of it, their situation, who they were, but not entirely. And when I met Mark, what he ended up doing was actually taking me into a world that was right in front of my eyes that I didn't see at all. And so from that first day of filming, which you see at the beginning of the film, our very first day of filming was going into the storm drains, the tunnels. There was an entire community living there in the dark. And it was Mark who brought me into this community. And it was this experience of sort of realizing that there were almost like two realities going on, and that we were seeing one, those of us that live in our, housed sort of secure world of the day-to-day that we do, and this whole other community that was there that most of us aren't seeing. And as soon as I started spending time with Mark, it was remarkable. He would take me into a situation, and all of a sudden we would be talking to people that, he immediately connected with, we would start talking with. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly, except that I felt what he did is he opened a door into a world and communities that are right there, that are right in front of all of us that we're not seeing. And so that's one of the things that I think is remarkable about the work that he does, and he continues to do, he's still doing it now, is that he can see, I think from his own experience of having been homeless himself, but also just an incredible awareness. And he even said to me, he's most comfortable talking to the people that he connects with in those videos and that he meets, and really appreciates that relationship. And I think you can see it, it's genuine. And it was just always remarkable to me that his ability to sort of connect with someone who was really struggling, who was having difficulties, and really putting them at ease and really connecting with them. So I don't know, again, I'm still not sure I'm answering your question, except that it was remarkable to sort of understand that there is this whole invisible community of people that most of us, if we have an understanding of, is very peripheral, that he just made me realize it's a full community right there.
And I think that's one of the powers of documentary filmmaking, is to do just that, to make the invisible visible. Pope Francis frequently says in his writings that reality is bigger than ideas, that reality is bigger than our language even. So I've got a question for you, Kat. When we think about the language of homelessness in the profession, do people begin to avoid that term? Do we talk about it differently? Do we?
Sure. So I can talk about this a little bit from a global perspective. The Institute of Global Homelessness, which is a partnership between Depaul University and Depaul International, which means Chuck and I have a few different connections, but I'll let him talk about his organization. Our mission, we started in 2014, and our mission is to support the global movement to end homelessness. And we sort of launched straight into program work and exchanging knowledge, and a lot of people said to us, whoa, 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 we don't even agree on what homelessness means across different countries and globally in different places. We haven't been able to collaborate around this because we don't share a common vocabulary and we don't understand it in the same way. And actually there are examples in the movie as well of things that even within the US, some people would say that person's homeless, that person's not. There's kind of contention around definitions within countries. And what we learned is that homelessness is defined differently in different countries. We set out in 2014 to come up with a standard global definition and realized pretty quickly that wasn't the right way to go, and there are various reasons for that. And instead we developed a typology of everything that people consider homeless, inclusive of everything that we heard, that would allow people to say, I'm talking about this solution, or I'm measuring this, and it's 1A through 2D, and kind of have a way to make those comparisons. So that's work that's still pretty early, shockingly, given the amount of work that's gone on around homelessness. And then again, I think there's a lot of contentiousness around definitions that you probably encountered while you were making the film, and Chuck, you've probably encountered in Chicago and other cities. The word homelessness, I would be interested to hear what Chuck thinks about this as well. I think there are a lot of people who don't like it, but the horse is kind of out of the stable, and it's just become the word that we use because it's so widely understood at this point.
Yeah, I've never met with a homeless person who was objected to being called homeless. I think people who provide programs sometimes stumble over this issue and want to be respectful, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, we use different terms in different programs. We don't call people clients in my organization, which is Depaul USA. We're a national provider of homeless services based here at the university, separate and apart from the university, but working with the university. And we've got programs in 6 different cities and 6 states. But we will use the term like a guest or a participant or a resident. Mm-hmm. But I think, when you're working with with the homeless communities, you will find that people are very real. They understand the situation they're in. They may be ashamed of what's happened to them, but I don't think they worry about the language as much as perhaps policymakers or providers do.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add that
Sure.
One of the things, as I was filming, it was pointed out to me is that just saying homeless, what it does is it sort of dehumanizes someone. It's not connecting it to a person. It makes it sound like it's this sort of blanket issue, and it sort of disconnects it from, and you guys can speak on this, but it was pointed out to me that even just saying a homeless person or homeless people makes a difference between just saying they're homeless, and so there were little things like that I learned as I was filming. Just it's a level of sensitivity. It's like we're actually talking about a human being, a person who's in a difficult situation. And so if we start to reduce them to the sort of most general issue that we're seeing them as, we've sort of lost that ability to kind of connect with them a little bit. And that was something that was pointed out to me, and that really stuck with me, that I really, and I think you both probably can speak to that really well in terms of just, I think when you're talking about the issue, it's easy to forget that we're talking about people,
Yeah, and homelessness, if you will, is like a destination that some people end up at,
Right.
but for a variety of reasons, as you saw in the movie, it can be purely economic. People become homeless because of natural disasters. I mean, that happens in this country all the time. People become homeless because of mental health illness. People become homeless because of family breakups. So it's sort of a place that people end up, if you will, but the causes are different and the solutions are disparate as well.
And I think to build on the last two comments, there's a big push in certain parts of the homelessness sector to say people experiencing homelessness. There's sort of a lot, there's kind of like the homeless on one end, and then there's people experiencing homelessness on the other, and kind of a lot of different ways that you can talk about it in between. But I think the sentiment is that we should be seeing homelessness as something that a person goes through and not a permanent part of their identity. And so saying something like the homeless makes it seem like it's just an intractable thing that's going to be true of that person forever. And so there's kind of a debate about and which language you think is practical. I think sometimes people with lived experience of homelessness gets hard from a communications. If you do use Twitter, it's like then your whole tweet is used up. But I think there's a lot kind of in between in ways that we talk about homelessness and homeless people, and a big push right now, especially in the US, to find ways of doing it that doesn't make it seem like that's just who the person will be forever.
One of the stories that struck me was the family of 5 staying in the hotel for 29, whatever it was, 99 a day, which I'm not very good at math, but that's about $900 a month. That seems really expensive as a way to find that solution. Mm-hmm. But it just struck me that, you know, part of the making the invisible visible, there's a lot of dimensions to that. So I wonder, in your work over the years, what has been invisible previously that's now visible to you about homelessness? What was surprising, or something that maybe you hadn't expected before, or a dimension or a problem that you know, in your work just kind of came to the surface?
So I think what I've really seen is that there is just an absolute dearth of affordable housing for people. So there is a statistic, and I don't know the source right now, or I'm forgetting the source right now, but for every 100 extremely low income families in the United States that would qualify for affordable housing, there are only 35 available units. So there is a lack of housing, and if you look at the statistics on housing for the past year, the numbers actually went up for the first time since 2010, and a lot of the increase is being attributed to high cost of housing in urban centers, particularly on the 2 coasts. But even in a city like Macon, Georgia, where we have a big program and we try to take people from the streets into our day center and then eventually get them into housing, there's really a lack of places we can place people that are affordable, safe, and clean. You'll pay $600-700 for a room in a boarding house with a shared toilet in a terrible part of town that has crime problems or has drug problems, and oftentimes putting people there without support, so they're going to end up back on the street. So, I mean, I was aware of the issue of affordable housing, but I think this work has really made clear to me the absolute need, and I think my organization, Depaul USA, is moving more in that direction, trying to develop affordable housing, albeit on a small scale. We want to grow that, but we're hopefully developing homes in Little Rock, and we're trying to start a new housing project in Macon, Georgia, that will house 20 people. But there's also the issue of a family. You know, it's much easier for an organization like mine to house single people because the cost and the physical needs that you have to house one person are so much cheaper than trying to house a family. So I really felt for that woman with the 5 children, and also probably the issue she would have with a landlord wanting to know, who's going to supervise the children when she's working, what's going on. So I think the affordable housing thing for me is really what's really gripping me now.
Could I just speak to that interview? Because the cinematographer on this film, who's a good friend of mine, was a woman and a mother. When I was making this film, obviously I'm a woman and I'm a mother. Not the obvious part of the mother, but and that interview was so painful and powerful for all of us, because we basically left sort of completely identifying with her. She is just, and one of the things I'm struck by is those children were so well behaved. I don't know if you noticed that. It's like they were well behaved. They knew what they had to do. They were supporting their mother. I mean, she just really, we were struck by, as he says later in the movie, there but for the grace of God. It was like she was a mom trying to take care of her children, and it was, we all left, I mean, Mark expresses it in the film, but we all left feeling how he expressed in the film, that we were all just completely shattered sort of by how difficult it was for her just to sort of keep her kids, in a place to stay. And I would also say we had a screening in Evanston, and one of the discussions that came up afterwards is that there is going to be, in a short period of time, no affordable housing in Evanston. The housing market is such there that there's just not going to be any homes that people can afford that are not in a certain bracket, you know, and that's what you're talking about. It's like, this isn't just about, you know, whether living in a shelter or this or that. It's like just regular affordable housing for people who aren't sort of very wealthy, and I think that's a growing trend. Anyways.
Great. I thought we'd move on to the next segment, so thinking about, you know, kind of effective programming. But I wanted to start with a quote that was in the film. The world does not need random acts of kindness or a month of impact. We need deliberate, intentional acts of compassion as a lifestyle. So instantly this brought up, you know, the quote from Vincent Depaul, there's great charity, but it's poorly organized. This is, you know, one of his great insights in Chatillon in 1617. So Chuck, how does your work at Depaul USA organize charity?
So I think we take another one of Vincent's quotes to heart, and that quote, if I'm not mangling it, is that love is inventive unto infinity, right? So our programming tries to be as inventive as possible. And so what that means also is that when we go to a community, when we're invited to a community, we try to find out what's needed, what's not being done, or what's being done poorly, or what's not being done in adequate measures. So our programs vary from housing DePaul University students who might be homeless here in Chicago, to a day center in Macon, Georgia, to a health clinic, to a medical respite. So this idea of filling needs and actually finding out from the community what is needed. And then again, I try to make sure that the organization is consistent with the Catholic social teaching of subsidiarity, which is the idea that decisions that are made at the lowest local level that is appropriate is the best way to respond to a problem. So we let the programs grow organically and respond to individual needs and community needs. And then we always try to find a role for volunteers to be involved. We're a professional organization. We have 60 full-time and part-time staff, but we have scores of volunteers who help us deliver services. And oftentimes those volunteers are our participants. So if you go to our day center where I was earlier this week in Georgia, the people washing out the showers and organizing the towels and working in the laundry room are people who've used those services. We try to be good stewards of our resources. We try to respond to local community needs. And then we also, I think, Vincent was also a risk taker, and so where people don't want to do things, we'll often step into the breach and try to do it. So nobody in Philadelphia was providing medical respite, which is a place where homeless people can go after they get out of the hospital so they don't recover on the streets or get sick again on the streets. So we opened the first respite in Philadelphia. And then, we try to do this all by raising the money we need to do it, by not incurring debt, and just trying to make sure that our programs are sustainable, because if we were to do something and had to stop, that could probably do more damage. We don't want people to get services and then have to withdraw those services. So thankfully in the last 9 years we've been able to grow and have not pulled back any services.
I'm thinking about that scene at the Los Angeles County winter shelter, and they're talking about kind of that revolving door of services. People go out and they're back on the street and they're back in the system, and it just seems kind of chaotic, right? And so I wonder, Kat, from your perspective, do you see, the revolving door of very, at the policy level, where if there was just a intervention to stop that revolving door, that, we might be able to address things at a larger level?
Yeah, I think you definitely see the revolving door when charity is not organized well, as St. Vincent, I think, put it very succinctly. And I've been thinking, listening to Chuck, and also thinking a little bit about that quote. There's a group in Canada called the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness that talks about the causes of homelessness and classifies them as structural, systemic, and individual, which is a framework I've always found really helpful. So there are a constellation of reasons that people might become homeless, and some of them have to do with affordable housing, with discrimination, with a lot of things that are happening kind of at the very high level in the place where we live. And then there are reasons people might become homeless that have to do with the way the system is organized, and this is the revolving door that shouldn't be a revolving door. Are people being discharged from jail or hospitals without somewhere to go? Are the systems connecting well to be able to kind of pick those people up and have a quick way to get them back into housing? And then the individual causes, I think, are what some of the more ugly commenters on the video that we saw, the woman with her family, kind of want to pin everything onto, which is a crisis or something that you're going through personally. And I think the revolving door really speaks to that second layer in a city. If your systems aren't organized well, and if at the level of a city you're not coordinating across the programs that exist, they could be the best programs in the entire world. They could be as well run as Chuck's programs are run. And you're not going to end homelessness because they're not talking to each other. And the other thing that I think about too in this movie is, and in the frame of people not being invisible, is data and kind of knowing where people are coming from. If organizations and systems aren't talking to each other, if you don't actually know who people are and how they're entering homelessness kind of writ large in your city, you're not going to be able to set things up in a way where you'll catch people as they're going between those revolving doors. So I think there are cities that do this really well, and there are cities that do it really poorly. And it's definitely something that can lead to and affect homelessness. But part of, I think, the Institute of Global Homelessness's role is within the ecosystem of DePaul University, where I think you see different groups and different people fulfilling different elements of St. Vincent de Paul's kind of vision, just around dignity and around, now a lot of the quotes are leaving my mind and I'm afraid I'm going to mangle them. I think the Institute of Global Homelessness is really trying to speak to this, helping charity to be better organized. So we try to work with city leaders to help them do that systems tier better, so that you can have organizations like Chuck's doing really good work that are linked into something that's not just going to ensure that someone ends up on the street kind of a year later.
If I could add something there, I think this video makes a pitch. It's not explicit, but for the housing first model, which is this idea of putting people in homes first, and then once they're housed, they can address the other collateral issues like health or employment and things like that. And I think there's lots of data that shows that can be a very effective intervention. But I also think that you need all kinds of programs working to get people ready for housing. So like our day centers where people come in and they become socialized, and that's where you make the contact and start working with them so they can get housed. But that's just, I think there are certain policies that work better than others, but as Kat says, we all need to be talking with each other, and I think there is a lot of territoriality in the nonprofit sector, and so breaking down those silos and being willing to share resources and share programs is critical as well.
And actually, one, I know you probably have to move on, but one exciting example in Chicago is that a lot of hospitals here have started to fund housing. So UI Health, affiliated with UIC, has identified people who are so expensive in emergency room bills, because as we saw, it's really hard to manage your health while you're living on the street, that they said, you know what, it's gonna be cheaper if we get this person an apartment. And they've started doing pilots in the last year where they've been doing that, and it's actually been working pretty well. So I think there's something about connecting systems and not just being siloed and thinking, okay, my job is to provide you health care and my job is to put you in a jail cell. But actually, when you start to look at how things are connected, a lot of really great things are possible.
And at that hospital, they were saying that the cost of providing care to the homeless men and women who came through was 70 times higher than the traditional patients. So, you know, if they just get $1,000 to put them in an apartment for a month, they're saving half their ER costs for that patient. So.
Could I just ask about the tent city scene? Because I'm always struck by that conversation where Mark basically says, you know, you wouldn't be living in tents if the system was really working here and helping you. And, you know, aren't there shelters or something? And he said, well, there are. But if you've got anything, if you're younger, if you're healthier, if you've got anything, they kick you out. And one of the things they tell you when you're leaving, where the tent city is. And I'm curious, I'd be, again, in the same context, I'd be curious what you think about that. To me, I can't quite fully understand, is it an overtaxed system? Is it a silo system? I'd be curious both of your responses to that particular scene, what you thought of it and what you think was going on in it.
One way of answering that question, and I think there are probably several ways, and Chuck will help me with some of the ways that aren't going to spring to my mind, but one way of answering it for me is that the system just wasn't offering those men what they needed or asked for, and what they needed and wanted wasn't necessarily to stay in a shelter. It sounded like what they wanted was some kind of housing or a more permanent solution than that. And I think a question that comes up often is, why are people staying on the street, even in places where there are shelter beds? A lot of times people will still be on the street, and I am certain that Chuck has encountered this. And the question people ask, or the thing that they say is, so basically those people want to be homeless. They don't want to come inside. They're choosing to be here. But usually what's happening, I would unscientifically say, like 999 times out of 1,000, if you actually talk to that person about what they need and what would help them to get off the street and what kind of solution they want, they would have an answer that isn't the shelter that's down the street. That's actually pretty reasonable. That might be the same answer I would have. So I think we can get caught up in shelter capacity when the question to me is more about what actually would have helped those two men to exit homelessness altogether. Sort of not answering your question, but asking
No,
what
I
I
mean,
think is kind of a...
Yeah, I think, and actually even in Albuquerque, when the man is saying, you've never been in a shelter, it's the last place I would choose.
Yeah.
It goes to what you're saying. Not all of these solutions are really, it's not that someone chooses homelessness, it's that the solutions available to them aren't good solutions for them, right? And I don't know if I'm pulling you off.
No, I
subject
think
there.
you're right. But and in a lot of the cities we're working, there's movements now to start these camps because city governments are moving people out of public parks and off the streets, and there's been a move back to the cities, right? And so in Little Rock, there's an organization that wants to create a camp for the homeless, and they want it to be managed, and they want to have social services on site. And there's also this issue in Georgia as well. So there are a lot of places that are looking to this as a type of solution. And I'm kind of conflicted about it because, on one hand, there are people in my team that have signs that say a tent is not a house, it's not a home. But it could be a step up for some people, and I think a lot of it depends upon how well it's managed. They've had to close down some tent camps in Seattle and other places because of hygiene issues and safety issues. But potentially, if it's well managed, it may be a place where people go in the interim. We've had people come to us in Arkansas and say they don't want to ever live in a house again. They don't ever want to be responsible for utilities. They don't ever want to be within four walls, but they would be in a tent, and they would be out happy being in a tent community. And I don't know how much of that is, because of the realities, what they experience, mental illness, or just a genuine feeling. But I think potentially, if well managed, it could be something that some people would opt for because there is great resistance to go into shelters and even sometimes housing. And if people aren't socialized to go in housing, it's not going to happen.
Before we go on to the next segment, I want to talk briefly about what's at stake with homelessness, because there are a lot of issues. I look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot on the plate there. And one of the challenges, I think, thinking about homelessness as an issue is it may appear that there are other issues that are more pressing, but there's a lot at stake with this. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and the homeless population, first of all, around Skid Row has been there for a very long time, for decades, but it's growing at such a fast rate. So what's the consequence of this? What's the social consequence of this persistent problem?
I mean, I think since 2010, the number of people who are homeless has decreased in the United States. It went up last year. So I think what's exciting about this is that it's a solvable problem. The number went up, as I said, last year, but less than 1%. So it's a problem that we can solve. But I think it is a corrosive problem. Like, I think it's something that makes society coarser and cheaper if we have people living on the streets and we turn a blind eye to them, we walk away from them. I think it's obviously terrible for the people who have to live, who are experiencing homelessness, but I think it sort of breaks down social cohesion when we exclude these people. We don't look at these people, but they're in our very midst. So I think it makes us less of a community to have this population that we're not fully housing or addressing. So I think it's deleterious for our social well-being.
And I also think, so the Institute of Global Homelessness is also working a little bit to try to get homelessness to be included in a measurement toward the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is something that our co-founder, Mark McGreevy, who also has worked with Chuck's organization, has been doing a lot in the last month, which is making the case that if you're not addressing homelessness, you can't end poverty. You can't make a claim to have ended poverty when you have people living on the street. And one of the goals is Goal 11 has a sub-measurement about making sure that everyone has adequate housing, and homelessness is not one of the measurements toward that. And there you kind of can go through and look at the healthcare element of that, and homelessness is sort of invisible across these goals. But if you look at an individual or you look at a group of individuals within a city, it's really difficult to solve a lot of those other problems if you don't have housing. And I think we saw that, I think probably the most irreverent, but my favorite quote was, "It's hard to do homelessness sober."
I know.
It's hard to do homeless sober. And you see all these problems that are related to health, that are related to poverty, that are related to trying to find employment, that are really hard to solve on the street. So I think all the reasons that Chuck said, and I think first and foremost should be that we shouldn't accept that our neighbors are sleeping on the street. I think there's kind of an ethical, moral dimension to it, but I think practically it connects to so many of the other things that we're trying to solve that it just makes sense to solve it because we can.
I also feel like when Sam in the film says, we've come to view homelessness as a character issue rather than an economic issue. I think when we start shifting the root causes of a lot of this onto the person because they're having a difficult time with either mental illness or addiction or whatever it is, we sort of lose the ability to kind of make this a community issue, right? Because we start to blame the individual, then we can separate ourselves from the individual, right? And it's their problem, it's them, that's not us. So they become the negative impact on our good community versus the other way around, which is our community is not good because we are not helping these people. So it inverts sort of, how these issues can start to change. And I think that's something that I really learned. It's like until we start really talking to people, start connecting them, connecting with people on some very fundamental level, it's very easy to separate ourselves, right? And then it can become, invisible, like you said, even in the data of like what needs to be addressed. And I just, every time I hear that, it's like, it's an economic issue, and things I heard is most people are only homeless a day. Most people, chronic homelessness is only a certain percentage of the population. There's a lot of misperceptions that we have about this, but it's usually the people that do not have some kind of a social structure that can hold them up. There's a lot of people that have the same issues that the people in the film have, but have family that are helping them. Often it's the people that don't have any of those support systems. And I remember Roseanne Haggerty, who was, one of her quotes was that the homeless population are like the canaries in the coal mine. That the higher the homeless population in any community, it's showing you that social services are breaking down in that community and that there's a direct relationship between those two things. So back to your question of like, what does this mean? What does this systemically mean for this to keep happening and being a part of our culture and our societies is that it's like we're losing that ability to see that they are telling us that our systems are not taking care of our community. And why we think we're not going to be somewhere in that continuum at some point is what's sort of the thing that really struck me, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Why do we think that we're not going to be, at some point, fall into that, circumstances change for us or something like that? That's the other thing I learned in making the film, is I really got in touch with my own vulnerability around, what is security and what makes us feel secure in a community. And I was really struck by, how little people were asking for to feel that security. It wasn't a lot that nobody was saying, I need $1 million, or I need a mansion. They were saying, I need a job, I need a house and a job. And then I want to help others. I can't tell you how many people we heard that from. So I was really struck by that. People aren't asking for a lot, but they're asking to be included. They're asking to be a part of the community.
So that's a great segue into the third segment that has, focused more on a policy orientation, but policy is never divorced from politics. And so what I heard in those comments, the social media comments, are kind of two dichotomies. One wants to blame, the individual, and it's about individual choice, and the other end of the spectrum wants to blame, systems and institutions. But reality is bigger than ideas, and so you hinted at, or what you said earlier on, is that layered approach, that there are elements, there are bad choices, and I think Mark's story is a great one. He made some horrible choices,
Right.
And he suffered the consequences of those choices. And yet there's also systemic issues at play as well. So I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on your, that framework that you think about this issue.
Yeah, I think that, and sort of building on Suzanne's comment too, when people tell me that person's homeless because they have an issue with substance use or mental illness, it always rubs me the wrong way, because I knew so many people in college who had problems with substance use. I have family members who struggled with mental illness. Probably everyone in this room can think of people in their lives who didn't become homeless. Like, it's just too simple of an explanation. And it's not unrelated. So it's also, I think, too simple to say the lives of the people who become homeless have nothing to do with their homelessness, because I think if you go too far down that route, you're not thinking about that as part of the solution. But really, it's usually somewhere in the mix, I think, of the three layers, the systemic, the structural, and the individual. And I think as a sector, we need to work on all three. I think programs do a really good job of working with individuals to help them exit homelessness and understand what's going on and what they need. I think people working at the city level can do a good job understanding the data, and I am going to start talking about things that are just not exciting to many people after seeing these beautiful stories and having a film that actually makes this issue come alive. But honestly, just understanding who is homeless, why they're becoming homeless, integrating the systems, setting targets. So of the places we've seen end homelessness, come pretty close to ending homelessness, reduce homelessness. So there's Finland, Medicine Hat is a city in Canada that functionally ended homelessness in 2015. In the UK, they reduced homelessness by 2/3 in the early 2000s. There are a few things that you see in common, kind of at that systems level. They decided to do it. So we don't have evidence in the world of a place that ended or reduced homelessness by accident. So you've got some political will, and you've got some organization, and people rowing in the same direction, saying we have a reduction target, we have an ending target. There's coordination, which I've already talked about. There's a mix of prevention, emergency services, and housing. And Chuck has talked about this a little bit, that there are kind of different elements to programs that are essential for different places in the stages of homelessness. But in my opinion, often there's too much of a focus on emergency services and not enough on prevention and housing-led services. And then there's an investment of resources, or there are resources present to actually kind of fund and move the work forward. And all those things are incredibly complicated and difficult to pull off, but those are things we've seen that have been consistent. And it's, I would say, necessary but not sufficient. There's usually a little bit more than that, of people understanding their own communities and being able to stop the inflow in specific ways that wouldn't work in another city. But I think without those things, it's really hard to think about solving this problem in a really meaningful way. I can't remember the question you asked, but I think it had something to do with that.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to hear more success stories, because I think that's one of the things that, because it's such a long-standing issue, it feels very intractable to a lot of people, but it is solvable. I mean, that's how we end the film, because that's what we heard from people. It's like, this is not an issue that has to be with us forever. It's like it hasn't always been with us. It doesn't always have to be with us. There are solutions. So I love that you sort of laid that out, but I would just love to hear some of the more success stories. You know, I think what you're doing, Chuck, obviously is a success story, but other examples of that I think would be, you know, I think people need to hear that. I think they need to know this isn't just, you know, endless, that there are,
Yeah, and I think we have to be clear what we mean when we say we end homelessness. And you talk a little bit about functional zero, which I think, you know, people don't, maybe haven't heard before, but it's not to say that people won't become homeless in the future. They always will become homeless, as long as there are natural disasters or economic catastrophes, or, you know, people will become homeless, but the goal is to have a place for those people when they hit that, or when they become homeless, so that there's a place where people can go. It's not to say that there's nobody in Medicine Hat, Alberta, who's going to experience homelessness, but there's a place where they can get services and they can get housed. And so this idea of functional zero.
Yeah, and not only that there's housing available, but that they have demonstrated that their system is capable of finding the person and moving them into and kind of matching them with that housing, which sounds like a very technical detail, but there are places with a lot of vacant housing that can't manage to match the two together. So in Medicine Hat, I'm going to use this as a theoretical definition because I can't remember it exactly, but it's something like no one's going to experience homelessness for more than 10 days, and between connecting with them and having them in a housing unit, it's X amount of time. So they've got this kind of technical definition behind it. But Chuck's right. I am the most optimistic person in the world about solving and ending homelessness, and I don't think you're going to have a Chicago where no one ever spends a night on the street. So I think that's why when I think about the prevention, emergency services, and housing, there's always going to be a role for emergency services, even in a city that has functionally ended homelessness. And I really think that there's reason to hope, and there are examples of success. The really easy ones to point to are the big dramatic, the Finland, which went from 20,000 to 8,000 people who were homeless across the country in a number of years, and the Medicine Hats. But I think even in the US, if you look at certain subpopulations like veterans.
Yeah.
So in 2010, President Obama's administration set a goal to end veteran homelessness by 2015. And there's a reason that I find this story funny. He announced in the State of the Union in 2016 that they had reduced veteran homelessness by 47%. And then the headlines the next day were like, President Obama fails. He said he was going to end it by 2015, and all they did was cut it in half, which I always just think is hilarious because I'm like, they cut veteran homelessness in half. And that was a really concerted effort that they put resources behind. So there were special housing vouchers for veterans. There were service dollars attached. There was technical assistance rolled out to cities around specific interventions. The Department of Veterans Affairs was involved federally and locally, making connections with local teams. And there was a dent, a real reduction in veteran homelessness, which to me doesn't mean the problem's over or that we've solved homelessness, obviously, in the US. But it does show that when we decide to do this and we have the right mix of interventions and we put resources behind it and there's political leadership, a lot more is possible than we might think. So I think there are success stories beyond the Finland and Medicine Hat, which everyone talks about all the time. Yeah.
So I want to ask one more question that's open to everyone, and then we'll take some questions from the audience in a few minutes. I'm thinking of Caleb Poirier from Camp Take Notice, the tent city in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And what really struck me about his story was that it's not necessarily about housing, it's about a community and relationships. And so sometimes when we think about homelessness, it's, just get people in a shelter or it seems like a materialist understanding of the issue. So I wonder, this is open to anyone, do you think those kinds of dimensions are really central to this issue?
Absolutely, and I think that's why we run day centers, which are not considered a best practice by policymakers. They're a place where people can come in off the street, take a shower, get a meal, but they don't ostensibly house anybody. They don't have housing on site. But what we find is that people come there because they want, even the house people, they come because they want social interaction, they crave community. We try to build individual relationships with them. We know their names, we know their histories, and that sometimes often allows us to serve them better. But people who have been housed, they still need that kind of connection. And so in St. Louis, where you put 75 people in their own apartments across the city, our social workers go out every day and work with them so that they stay housed, because if they don't stay on their medicines, if they don't keep their house clean, if they don't go to the doctor, if they don't come home at night because they're craving company, they may lose their housing. So you have to have services, and the services have to be have a social component. You have to interact with people. You can't treat them as just numbers. And I think most people get this. In this field, but it's critical to the success of the program, and it also creates an environment where I think people can make real progress.
I just remember, and I think that tent city is a great example. He was staying there because he had friends there. Those were his friends. They weren't just people that he was staying next to in a tent. They became a community. They became friends with each other. They looked out for each other. And I remember hearing from Mark about how sometimes people that had been sort of living together on the street got moved into housing in different locations in the city. So they lost that connection they had as they were living together. And often what they would do is come back to that location where they were living on the street. And a lot of times people don't understand. They're like, and that goes to that, what you were saying, well, obviously they want to be on the street. I mean, they don't want to stay in their apartment. Why are they coming back? They're coming back because those people they got to know in that situation became their friends, became their community. And so I think that was one of the things I learned. It's not just, I mean, think of it, if it were for any of us, it's like, we're going to physically solve your problem, but we're going to put you 30 miles from the rest of your family. Yes, here's an apartment for you, but you don't know anyone there. They already know that maybe you're suspect because it's, for some reason it's Section 9, whatever. I know that you work with that, but it's like sometimes you're put into a housing situation where people are like, well, who is that person? Why are they being put here? So they don't know anybody, and they're already feeling a little bit uncomfortable about their own situation in this new housed environment. I just think it's one of those obvious things. It's like, we wouldn't want to be without our friends, right? It's like, yes, I'm off the street, but it's like, I don't know anybody here and nobody wants to talk to me. It's just like, I think and Caleb really, I was so struck by that because he left his family because he was so ashamed of his mental state. And the only place he felt comfortable was in that tent city. He felt like people accepted him there in a way that the housed community and his family couldn't. So I think there's something to that too. We want to be accepted, all of us do. And I think there's something to that. But
in that hospital story you cited about the University of Illinois, Chicago, putting people in housing as the people who are using the ER, the super users, there was an NPR story about it, and it concluded with one of the people they had housed still comes back to the ER, but not for services, but to talk to the nurses because he misses the nurses.
Right.
And I think that's just very symptomatic of the fact that you make connections, you want to keep those connections. So having a day center like we do in Little Rock or in Macon creates a place where people can get off the street. So it's also responsive to city demands and business demands that they don't want loitering. We're like, yeah, come in, you can sleep, you can have a cup of coffee, you can relax here, and we'll try to work on onward progress for you. But I think socialization is critical. It's a basic human need.
yeah.
It is. Do I have time for a story, or are we moving to the next?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think maybe the whiteboard came out, so I'll try to make this quick. I agree. I think you can't ignore everything that surrounds a person and the needs that they have and just put them into housing. And something really interesting that we saw about 2 months ago was in Edmonton, Canada. In Edmonton, people who identify as Aboriginal or Indigenous are about 5% of the general population, but 48% of the homeless population. And they have had a really hard time finding success in helping these folks move out of homelessness. And they had kind of a eureka moment a couple of years ago when there was a family that they found housing for, or it was a woman and her son, and like the next day they went and the apartment was totally empty and everything had been moved out and they were back on the street. And they did these interviews and learned that in their culture, the family and the extended family are more important than just about anything. And there were rituals, like rites involving kind of burning sage and smoke that the landlord didn't like and kicked them out of the apartment. And there's this whole array of things that were really particular to their culture that weren't being factored in when they were moved into apartments. And now they have kind of an Indigenous case manager who is Indigenous, but also works with the population that identifies as Indigenous and finds like units where you can have like 5 apartments together and works with landlords to explain the different ceremonies. And I think there's so much that's more complicated than just you need to find an apartment unit and you need to put someone in it that breaks down socially but also culturally. And that's a really important thing that's going to look different in every place that providers really need to figure out. So thank you for letting me get that last.
Thank you. No, that's a great
great.
story. I think
Yeah.
it illustrates a number of things that we've been talking about. So we've got some questions from the audience.
Hi. So as a viewer, after watching a documentary like this, you always want to sort of take action in a very vague notion, right? So like, what could somebody do in response to homelessness in Chicago, for example, that would sort of be like taking action in a day-to-day life?
I was told this question was going to come.
I
It's
told you, it
it's a
comes up at
hard
every
one.
screening, yes.
So, I mean, I think it's a matter of individual conscience. I think something that's underrated but very important is establishing relationship or just being respectful when someone comes to you in the street, and you may say no, you may say yes to what they ask you for, but recognizing that they're there, making the eye contact, I think all that goes a long way to humanizing people. This sounds trite, but I think volunteering in programs, there are lots of programs that need support to deliver services. I also think that there's great opportunity for social entrepreneurism. If you think there's an unmet need, I think it's great for people to go out and start their own organization or their own approach. Some people don't like that. They think we should be more cohesive, but I think there are lots of people with great ideas and new twists on doing things. So if you feel the urge to go off and start something, do that. And then again, if you don't like giving money to people, I think you always can make a financial gift to a nonprofit. That sounds very self-serving, but we really have a problem with getting money that we can use for anything. Like today I learned that the brand new boiler we put in our building in Philadelphia needs a water softener to work. That's another $3,000 that I don't have in my budget. So it just shows that we need that kind of support. And just research the nonprofit to make sure you feel comfortable with how they shepherd and steward their resources. So treat people with respect, try to build a human connection. If you feel so inclined, be a social entrepreneur, be an advocate, and then support the existing structures that exist.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I have a question about what it was like making the documentary, and when you were directing and editing it, what were some of the challenges you faced in wanting to do justice to the story you were telling?
That's a great question, because I think there's a lot of documentaries that are made around this subject in particular that I think inadvertently and not intentionally end up doing a disservice sometimes, because they take the issue and they sort of either, and this is how it's been described to me, they either sort of turn the people that are in the film into these sort of noble people that are, it just pulls them out of the realm of reality. Or conversely, it turns it into a film where you feel nothing but pity for the people that you're seeing in the film. And one of the things that I was really aware of was that I wanted them to be people. I just wanted them to be people, and that's how I thought about them. They were people that I was meeting. I had the advantage of being with Mark, who was a great person for sort of introducing them to me, and he would always say to people, this is my friend, this is my friend. And he got me to really be thinking about, these are people that I'm meeting. And it allowed me to let go of the situation they were in, and think of them more as somebody I was just meeting and wanting to get to know. And so that connection that I made in both the filming and the editing helped me, I think, to sort of try to make a film that felt sort of balanced and wasn't, because I didn't want to exploit anybody's situation, and I was really aware of that, and there were things I left out specifically for that. And if there was ever a situation that we were filming and someone felt uncomfortable, we always stopped. So I would say we started the whole crew with a certain kind of sensitivity to who and what situations we were filming in, but also just, sort of, these are stories of people, these are stories of people, and these are the lives they're living right now, and these are the challenges that they have, and not making it more or less than that, right?
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for asking. Any other questions?
So I've got a question.
Okay. Okay.
I'll wait for Gary.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Well, actually, the question I've got is an editor making a film. It's almost like a film professor making a film.
Right.
Because ultimately, everything we do goes to the editor, and the
Right.
editor makes the decisions. What was that like?
It was ridiculous, because as a director, I put a lot of time and energy driving around the country, filming all sorts of things that I, as the editor, told myself not to use. And so it was a ridiculous conversation at times. And, that's why we brought in another editor who helped a lot. Obviously, I worked with a team at Kindling Group. There were a lot of people there who were great support. Laura Wilson, I don't know if she's in the audience tonight, Danny Elpert. So you don't make these films alone. So you're right. I had a lot of support, but you're absolutely right. It was an incredibly challenging film to make for a lot of reasons, but that was one of them. I had been an editor, and I have been a documentary editor for a long time. So I always got to play that role of being the person to tell the director, it's okay, we're going to figure it out. And I didn't have that person, because it was like I was talking to myself, and the director and me, and as we know, directors are way more insecure because it's like it's their work, right? And so I couldn't comfort myself. It was a terrible thing.
You did fine.
Thank you, I appreciate it. But it was definitely, and my husband is in the audience, he took on a brunt of this. I'd come home at night and he would help me on
I
occasion.
feel for him.
But that's a really good that was a really good question, Gary, because it's true. It's like that relationship between director and editor, especially in documentary, is really vital. And having that separation really helps. And when you don't have it, it can get really, really difficult. Yeah, so anyways. Good question. Anybody else? Are we good? You had a question.
So, well, no, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone that put this on, and for making the film and for your work, and just to reflect that it's DePaul University that makes all of this possible. So we're all people gathered together for this common interest in addressing homelessness. So
Right.
it's just such a privilege to be involved with DePaul University, to have a filmmaker, a program manager, and a policy expert, all within this same community. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank all of
Thank
you.
you.
Can I just ask that, sorry, got to get the last word in. Can you both give us information about your organizations and you about your organization so that people know where to go to get more information about what you both do?
So the organization I work with is called Depaul USA. It's a separate nonprofit apart from the university. We run services in Chicago for homeless DePaul University students, in Macon, Georgia, in Little Rock, Arkansas, in St. Louis, New Orleans, and Philadelphia. Over the course of a year, we'll serve about 4,500 people. It could be just one meal or one shower, or we could house them. And we do everything from day centers to permanent housing. You can see our website at DepaulCharities.org. It'll bring up the U.S. website. We're part of an international organization called DePaul International that has programs like ours, but in 6 other countries around the world.
And I'm with the Institute of Global Homelessness. We're actually a partnership between the university and DePaul International. So Chuck and I are half siblings, I guess, would be the right relationship. Our mission is to support the emerging global movement to end homelessness. We have programs that focus on research, exchanging knowledge. We have an online global research hub launching Monday morning. It's ighhub.org. It's not live yet, but it will be. And our website is IG Homelessness. So I for Institute, G for Global, and then the word homelessness spelled out.org. And we're just based at 55 East Jackson, so come visit us anytime you'd like.
Great. And can you just, for those that don't know, so they know to visit you too?
Sure. So I work in the Division of Mission and Ministry, and our work is really to ensure that everyone who works here or comes here as a student knows something about the name above the door. It's a mission that brings us all together.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.